Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. I am neither a security expert nor a historian of war per se. One of the areas that I focus on is political culture, broadly understood. What institutions, what sorts of relationships, what ideals does a culture create and sustain? So with that as a bit of an introduction, let me begin. And I want to take us back to the year 1980. Senator Edward Kennedy, Democrat, Massachusetts, decided, as some of you recall, to mount a challenge against an unpopular incumbent, Jimmy Carter, for the Democratic nomination for the presidency. Kennedy had long been a champion of many causes, including the draft. He had spoken out in opposition to the all-volunteer force, the AVF, created, as you heard from Professor Kennedy, in the tumult of the Vietnam era in 1973. For Senator Kennedy, a democracy required a draft in the name of citizen obligation and civic unity. None should be exempt, and he saw this as a logical outgrowth of his brother John F. Kennedy's injunction to ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Now, I was teaching at the University of Massachusetts at the time, and I decided to attend an on-campus rally supporting Senator Kennedy's bid to become the Democratic nominee. Speaking in the senator's behalf was his nephew, Joseph P. Kennedy. And at one point during a rather rambling presentation, which is the kindest description I can come up with, young Kennedy shouted, "And when my uncle is president of the United States, there will be no return of the draft." Senator Kennedy opposes military conscription, and President Kennedy will never stand for it. Now, the largely student crowd erupted, and this was, in fact, one of the biggest applause lines of the speech. So what happened? Why did Senator Kennedy turn on a dime? Political expediency is surely the clearest explanation, but we need to account for why this was an expedient move on the senator's part. Why was the draft so wildly unpopular? And I think the Vietnam era helps to account for that, of course. By 1980, it was clear, looking back, that much of the student opposition to the Vietnam War had been fueled by fear of being drafted. When you got to the lottery system, it was sort of matter of bad luck to serve your country. When the AVF got created, student opposition to the war more or less dwindled. Now, ironically, even as this drama was unfolding, the National Organization for Women, NOW, was busy mounting a campaign for women's inclusion in a draft, arguing in a 1981 amicus brief that women suffered, quote, "devastating long-term psychological and political repercussions," end of quote, given their exclusion from military service. Citizen equality demanded, now proclaimed equal responsibility for jeopardy when it came to military service. Now, what Senator Kennedy knew, however, despite NOW's proclamation and so on, was that the draft had been repudiated pretty much across the board, certainly by the younger generation, and he wanted that vote. Now let's try to place all of this in a bit of a historic context. You've heard a good bit of that already. In a book called Women in War, I unpack a position that I chose to call armed civic virtue. This is a discourse championed in the United States, for example, in World War I, by nationalizing progressives, those who embraced universal military training and conscription as, and these words may be familiar to one member of our panel, an effective homogenizing agent in what they regarded as a dangerously diverse society. Shared military service, one advocate colorfully argued, was the only way to yank the hyphen out of Italian-American or Polish-American or any other such imperfectly assimilated immigrants. Now, President Woodrow Wilson and other progressives supported conscription then as a way to mold the nation. and to stem the tide of particularism, if you will, to uphold the ideal of a nation one and indivisible. A progressive who had parted with his fellow progressives on the war issue, Randolph Bourne, who died in the flu pandemic of 1919, made some comments about this euphoria about the war's social possibilities in an incomplete essay on the state. And this is what Bourne had to say. War, or at least modern war waged by a democratic republic against a powerful enemy, seems to achieve for a nation almost all that the most inflamed political idealist could desire. Citizens are no longer indifferent to their government, but each cell of the body politic is brimming with life and activity. In a nation at war, every citizen identifies himself with the whole and feels immensely strengthened in that identification. And that's precisely what concerned Randolph Bourne, who believed that that strong version of armed civic virtue and the ideal of the state sort of molding the nation into one homogeneous entity, that was a danger and that was a problem. Now, this oft-proclaimed objective, let's mold the nation, takes us back even further, and in a longer discussion I would go back further yet, but I'm going to go back only to the French Revolution, when mass mobilization for war, the so-called levée en masse, first came into view. National conscription was the underpinning for this armed civic virtue project, preparing citizens for all-out war, men and women alike. The women didn't fight, but they did all the things that helped the men to fight. That this was possible as a goal turned on the triumph of the state, the centralization of political power and legitimacy being placed in a state formation, and then the attempt to fuse, if you will, nation and state. Warfare was democratized as never before. Once the purview of an elite group of knighted warriors preparing to die for their liege lord, pro patria more, now one fought and died for the collective. Although commoners had participated in battles prior to the French Revolution, it had not been as part of a general class of citizens. So it was under the battle cry of liberty, equality, fraternity that came about, as the French Revolution sort of aggressively spilled over its borders, as you know. As John Dewey later put it in his enthusiasm for World War I, war strengthened the power of the state, and this was altogether a good thing. Now, this view fits more tidily within the frame of a staunch sort of civic republicanism. Any of you who studied political thought will have some sense of that, and I apologize that I can't unpack it in the interest of time, but staunch civic republicanism associated, as you already heard, with people like Machiavelli, Rousseau, and so on, then a more restrained liberal constitutionalist ethos. Now, there is insufficient time to trace the fate of conscription in any detail. Suffice to say that the first half of the 20th century was, in some sense, a kind of golden age of conscription, if one can speak in this way. Conscription during the Civil War, as you know, had been ferociously contested, prompting draft and race riots and much else. It's a vivid portrayal of the New York draft race riots in Martin Scorsese's bloody epic, The Gangs of New York. Some of you perhaps have seen it. World War II, the Good War, lives on in memory as a time of civic unity and virtue, everyone pushing for the same goal, everyone prepared to sacrifice. That was certainly how my parents recalled it. It lives on in memory as something that perhaps might be again, somehow. Or maybe some hope we can get there to that ideal without the armed part. We can get to this notion of civic unity, but it needn't be that strong armed civic virtue idea. Now, how one sorts out the ethics and politics of all this is by no means simple. Let's unpack matters by reflecting on the nature of contemporary warfare and the trajectory of the last half century, where citizenship and citizen obligation are concerned. And there are two experts here who know much more than I about the nature of contemporary warfare. So my comments will be rather more general. One of the dilemmas of Vietnam was that the nation was mobilized for war. If you have a draft, you've got to do that. You've got to engage the citizenry, and you have to crank it up, so to speak. But not all the way. We didn't want a total war. This wasn't World War II. That wasn't the nature of the conflict. At the same time, we had to get folks sufficiently mobilized and engaged that they would be prepared to send their sons into battle. And this turned out to be an inherently unstable proposition. And as the war dragged on and the casualties mounted, things started to unravel. So our military today is, by contrast, and you've already got a sense of this, to Vietnam's grunts, is composed of a highly trained cadre drawn from certain classes, as you heard, prepared to fight complex but limited wars. Mobilizing the entire nation, putting the country on a war footing, is considered neither necessary nor desirable from the point of view of both our political and military leaders, at least the ones that I've spoken to. The military is strongly committed to the AVF, and our war preparedness, if you will, presupposes such a force. Personnel are trained often in very demanding specialties. Operationally, the argument is this is far more efficient than dealing with cohorts of unhappy draftees who are only looking to get out and have no real interest in staying the course and being, if you will, military people. In fact, mention the draft to a military officer, and he or she usually unleashes a torrent of why, at this time, the AVF is the only way to go. I also don't see any evidence that political control over the military, the accountability issue, has been seriously compromised or weakened by the institutionalization of an AVF. Thinking of some remarks that Secretary Gates made a few days ago when he said, if Congress decides to do away with don't ask, don't tell, of course the military will follow, because that will be the will of the American people, and the military cannot act independent of that. Now, to be sure, some broad cultural and social goals, the draft as an instrument of social equality, as you heard already, are lost in the AVF system, as the educated middle and upper middle classes can simply opt out. That was, of course, true to a great extent pre-AVF during the Vietnam era, given the role of exemptions and favoritism to college students, their ability really to game the system. I knew plenty of young men who did that at the time. That classic World War II movie scene of the Jewish kid, the Italian kid, the Irish or Polish kid, the WASP, maybe a Latino, all in a unit, all Americans, that really is no more. And even in those World War II scenes, there was a nettle, namely that there were no black soldiers, as they were not yet integrated into the military until after World War II in 1948 with President Harry Truman's presidential order. Instead, we see developing a military variously composed of men and women, but drawn from a similar class. And we also see the emergence of something like a legacy military. I'm not quite sure if that's the right way to put it, but let me explain what I have in mind. We see this on display as members of a family, generation after generation, choose to serve. The father serves, the son serves, the brother serves, and so on. The daughters serve. Now, this is nothing, certainly not at this point, nothing along the lines of an elite aristocratic warrior class, like the German general staff, for example. Rather, it constitutes a tradition of honor for these military families, even as it can certainly inspire resentment, those who do not undertake this responsibility. Again, I see no evidence that the existence of these military legacy families raises the specter, at this point, of a separate class chafing at civilian control. but you can certainly see the deepening of certain forms of social resentment. What this does point to is the fact that some families bear a radically disproportionate burden of service and sacrifice. As the rest of their peers study or work or frolic, they die in the sandbox, as Iraq is called, or in the inhospitable environs of Afghanistan. Is it armed civic virtue then for a minority and little or no civic virtue for the majority? Or are there other ways of embodying citizenship? This is a real challenge. Other ways to serve. Every now and then a flurry of activity erupts around this matter, but nothing much comes of it. Why not? Well, because I submit at this point, a liberal political culture such as our own, liberal in the philosophical sense, that over the past 5 decades has become nothing if not more voluntarist and more individualist, chafes at the very notion of mandated obligation. And that's why many argue that conscription is a form of servitude. We must be free to decide. Choice is our mantra. And I wonder if our political culture could even sustain a more collective solidaristic ethos for any substantial length of time. As I wind down, let me take 9/11 as our case in point. The reaction in the immediate aftermath of that horror was, as you all recall, extraordinary. All Americans were in solidarity with what happened at the Pentagon and in New York City. Ordinary citizens across the country dropped what they were doing. Hundreds journeyed to New York to help, give me something to do. Flags popped up everywhere. And I thought at the time, so this is what it feels like, this civic unity. But what a god-awful horror it took for such spiritedness to manifest itself. That may be the way with us right now. You cannot remain at that sort of fever pitch of horror or elation indefinitely, and you cannot manage or control or engineer that kind of thing. You cannot just bring it into being when you want to, get it on demand, so to speak. And in a democratic society, that would be undesirable in any case. It was in the totalitarian societies of the 20th century that matters were always kept at a fever pitch and an uproar. There were always enemies within and without, and people were held together, as the great political theorist Hannah Arendt puts it, by the iron band of totalitarianism. Get them all in an uproar and it keeps them unified and with us. In a liberal constitutional order, we will experience moments of collective elan, collective friendship that stretches from sea to shining sea, but most of the time we are absorbed in our families, our communities, and our own purposes. The civic danger comes, and I think this is the danger zone you've already heard identified, is that if that's all we see, our own engagements, our own purposes, and if that is reduced even further to the little isle of the eye, if we shun all notion of obligation and sacrifice, then a dangerous divide opens up between the military and civilian life. It means if we arrive at that point, and that seems to be the trajectory we're on, that we might, at some unhappy day in the future, be incapable of recognizing and honoring that commitment in others. We are so absorbed in our own purposes. Well, I fear I must leave it at on this rather sober note, frustratingly, because there's much more to say, but perhaps these other things will surface in the discussion. Thank you all very much.